take us too long. So I'll just give you a second to find your seat. So hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League Day of Remembrance, and then also the launch and exhibit of my book, Kazoku No Tame Ni. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm John Matsunaga, and I'm a visual artist, and I also teach Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. And I also serve on the education committee of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League. So in addition to myself, our speakers today will be Karen Tanaka-Lucas, Peggy Doi, and Todd Tsuchiya. So we'll have a number of presentations. So each of us will discuss our own personal stories relating to the Japanese American incarceration history. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for question and answers from all of you and some discussion. So I'm going to begin today by giving an artist talk about my book and exhibition. And then what I'm going to do is actually go through the images that are in the book in sequence so you can get a kind of preview, annotated preview of actually what's in the book. Because I don't add a lot of description in the book, so I'll be explaining what these images are that are in the book. So let me just give you a little bit of background explaining what the book is about and what I was trying to do. And so the photo book is titled Kazoku No Tame Ni, which loosely translated, it's like for the family, for the sake of the family, for the benefit of the family. This book addresses my family's incarceration during World War II and my efforts to come to terms with this aspect of my family's history. And so my mother, father, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everybody from that generation within my family were among the 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry who were living on the west coast of the United States during that time and were forcibly removed from their homes, imprisoned en masse in American concentration camps, and denied their constitutional rights. And so what inspired me to make this book is I wanted to learn more about my family's history and their own particular incarceration experiences, which when I started this project I knew very little about. I knew that they had been in camp, but I didn't really know any of the details. I didn't even know which camps they were in. That was the kind of level of detail that was missing. I just knew that they had lived through this historical moment. And so I researched my family's experiences by interviewing them. I sat down and talked to a number of relatives that were still surviving that had been through this experience. And I also asked them for any old family photos or documents or anything pertaining to the incarceration that they might have. And again, I was starting from not even knowing if there was anything in our family because I hadn't really seen anything prior to this. And so it was really a matter of just working through this and piecing together what I could, what kind of understanding that I could. And I think that's a common experience for many of us younger generations that weren't incarcerated and trying to tease out what was that experience like, what had actually happened from our family members that were incarcerated. And I think that's sort of a common experience for us. Another aspect of this book that I wanted to address through it is the transgenerational legacy and memories and trauma associated with the Japanese American incarceration that many Japanese Americans like myself continue to struggle with. So even though I did not experience incarceration firsthand, too young, it's a past that still haunts me. I live with this legacy because it happened to my family and my community. And that motivates me to then use that kind of haunting to speak out against similar injustice in the present today. And so my hope in doing this work is to inspire others to critically think about the long-term effects of racism, xenophobia, and all forms of bigotry, and the effects that they can have on families. And so it's never just the moment that it happens, that there's a lingering long, long afterlife of any of these kinds of events that continues to affect subsequent generations. It's something to think about. And also hopefully that work like this and other things in our discussion and events like these can inspire people to take action when necessary, when confronted with these kinds of bigotry that we encounter regularly in our society. And so I want to now just sort of move on to the images in the book and kind of go through them with you. And so I begin the book with this image of my family, my father's family, the Matsunagas. This was taken sometime, I'm not sure exactly when, but definitely during the 1930s. And so I use this to start off the first section of the book, where I present the pre-war and the pre-incarceration period for my family. And some of the images and just sort of piecing together what was life like before incarceration. And then that's my dad there. And my grandmother and my grandfather and a close family friend and uncle and aunt. So absent in the previous family photo is my Auntie Rosie, pictured here. And the reason why she was absent is because she was Kibe. And so she was educated in Japan. But for those of you not familiar with Kibe, Kibe are those Japanese Americans who were born in the United States. So they're American citizens, they're born here. But then they're sent back to Japan for their education, for a duration. And usually it was the eldest children who were sent, if sent at all. And so she was the eldest child, and my grandmother sent her to Japan, where she stayed from the ages of 4 to 18 years old. And so she lived with my grandmother, and my grandmother was by herself there. So I think my great-grandmother, she lived with my great-grandmother in Japan, and I think my grandmother felt like she was lonely in Japan, so she sent her daughter to live with her. And my dad was telling me how my grandfather, he didn't agree with having her sent away, and he missed her, and he resented my grandmother for it, didn't speak to her for a long time. But also my Auntie Rosie tells me how she was 4 years old. She did not know. My grandmother took the whole family there, so it was like a trip, and then she just left without my aunt. So she didn't even know she was good at what was going on, and then she's like, bye, and then so she was racist. So it's sort of kind of traumatizing for her too. She has the way she tells it. And so that's her there. And then here are my uncles on my mother's side, Noburo and Shigeki Taniguchi, who were also Kibe. So I'm just showing kind of some different family members, and you can tell by their uniforms and whatnot that they're in Japan. So this is part of that earlier pre-war Japanese experience. And then I show this photo that I took of, it's basically a barrel ring from the incarceration days that just sort of settled into the ground at the camp Topaz in Utah, so one of the War Relocation Authority camps. And so I traveled for a separate project to all these camps and made photographs, and I incorporate some of them in this book to sort of signify certain things or be symbolic of something. And so what this is symbolic of is it kind of looks like the Japanese flag, you know? And so really I'm using it here more to symbolize this sort of crumbling ties at this time between Japan, Japanese Americans, and then the United States during this pre-war period. And so this is a family photo that I found in my grandfather's photo book, buried somewhere in my aunt's garage. And what this is my mom's family, they were strawberry farmers in Artesia, California before the incarceration. And they were poor tenant farmers, so they didn't own their land. They would just work the land and could make money from that. And so this photo that I found is of the strawberries from their farm. So it's just kind of an interesting little tidbit of things that I was finding along the way in my search. And it was clear what this was. And so on the far left here, sort of in the shadows a little bit, that's my mom's mom, my maternal grandmother. And then here is my Uncle Henry and Uncle Joe. So my my mother's youngest siblings. So they were quite young. So this is during the 1930s, and this is on their farm in Artesia before the incarceration. And so they were quite young when they were sent to camp. So at this point in the book, I introduced the exclusion starting to happen. And so this is Exclusion Order 106, and this is the one that I went through the records and found that applied to where my father was living. So this would have been the exclusion order for my father's family. And so they lived in a small farming community called Sanger in California, just outside of Fresno. And so that's that right there. So it's in this area. And so they grew grapes. They were grape farmers. And that's what they did at the time. And they actually owned their land. So it was a little bit of a different situation for them when they came back, because they actually had a home to come to and property that they owned. The reason why I pointed out that this is Exclusion Order 106 is because there were 108 exclusion orders issued for the West Coast to forcibly remove Japanese American. And so being 106 means that this is much later. So this 108 were issued during 1942. And so his family is 106. So it's at the end of most other communities of Japanese Americans who were already placed into temporary detention centers. So on August 11th, 1942, that's when my dad's family had to show up and report to be removed. And because they were removed so late, they actually went straight to the War Relocation Authority camp at Gila River. And normally, for many other individuals, what had happened in many other communities, they would at first be rounded up and moved out of their communities and then go to a temporary detention center somewhere in California. And that would be the normal first sort of leg, and then they would be transferred to the War Relocation Authority camp. But because he was leaving so late, the family was rounded up so late that they just went straight to the camp. So they were some of the last to have to be forcibly removed, but maybe some of the earliest that actually ended up in the War Relocation Authority camps. Because many that were coming from the temporary detention centers will come in September or October or things like that, even as late as that. So as part of this project and for this book, I also photographed various family members, including those younger generations in my family who were not incarcerated, as a way of dealing with and addressing this sort of transgenerational legacy of this past. And so this is my sister Leslie. And when I photographed her, I asked her, what was something important to her that she would have to give up or leave behind if she was incarcerated. And she had said to me that she couldn't imagine having to leave her home, like to give up her home and leave it. And so I photographed her right in front of her in her own house, as to kind of draw that connection between the things of who the person is and the things that they would have to be missing. And I didn't ask her to pose like this, but she has this kind of defiant stance, kind of like, trying to take me away. And I didn't ask her to pose, so it's just like kind of perfect that she just sort of did that. And it had a little attitude there. And so this image here is of the camp at Jerome in Arkansas. And so that's where my mom's family was incarcerated. And it's this is an image from her yearbook. So I have one of her school yearbooks from camp. And so I scanned this image. It's just sort of a representation of the camp. But this is a part of the book where now I transition to the pre-war period to now that they're being incarcerated. And so the images that follow are the ones that deal with the incarceration of my family. And so they were incarcerated. My mom's family was incarcerated at Jerome from 1942 to 1944 when the camp closed. And let's see. Okay, so this is an interesting photo to me, at least, because I recently found this buried in that same photo album of my grandfather's that was in Aunt's garage that was just no one really knew about. And I was looking through it, and I found this actual photo of my mom's mom, my maternal grandmother, in camp. And I had never seen any images of any grandparents in camp. And so this is her right here. And so this is so when she was in camp in Jerome, Arkansas, she actually worked in the mess hall. And so this is just a photo of her with her mess hall co-workers. So I just found it kind of interesting in learning a little bit more of what she was doing, and then even just having this image. So again, this was a process of just discovery, just finding little fragments, pieces, things, clues here and there, trying to learn more and more of what I could about this experience. So here are some more pictures of my Uncle Henry, who you saw earlier, was Joe on the farm, but this time in Jerome. And so here he is. And so he's with his classmates here, which I assume is like kind of a school photo, something like that, I think, just how they're arranged like this in camp. And then here he is over here again in front of their barracks. And it's sort of interesting. You can't really read that here, but in the original, the plaque reads 5-03-B, which was their address. And so I have a better sense, again, when I'm trying to learn. So my mom said to me, I was like, what was your barracks? And she remembered her number. She said it was 5-03-A. And so I was like, okay, maybe she was remembering it, maybe she's not, I don't know. But then now seeing this photo, I know that their actual particular room within this full barrack was right here. Because it's right next to where that thing is. So it's just, again, it's interesting that for all these years later, she remembered her address in camp. So I find that, and again, talking about this sort of language of these memories and how they stay with former incarcerees. And so this is an inscription in my mom's yearbook from a friend. So the Jerome camp closed in 1944, and so this would have been around that time. That's when the yearbook dates to as well. And so it's a friend. I won't go through the inscription, but she's basically saying, "Oh, it's nice to meet you." It's interesting too because these are 8th graders, and the way that they talk to each other is so sophisticated. Because it was like, oh, you finally meet somebody, and then you have to depart, and that's life, this kind of thing. And so it's kind of interesting as 8th graders dealing with these kinds of things and talking this way. But she basically says goodbye, and then she says, "Oh, write me," and then I think this is 12F-3B, which is her new address in Amache. So as the camp closed in Jerome, this particular individual and her family went to Amache. And so when Jerome closed in 1944, my mom's family was transferred to Gila River in Arizona, the same camp that my father's family was in. And so this is a photo of my mother right here. She actually wrote her name, so that makes it easier for me to figure out. I can tell her though, see her face. And they did that in the things, they write their own name on that picture. So this is her 8th grade class photo of that yearbook. And so this is actually the photos from the yearbooks that I'd seen, and this one in particular. It's the earliest photos I have of my mother. I don't have any photos seeing her any younger than this. And I have photos after camp, but these are the earliest photos that I have of her. So this is the youngest I've ever seen her, and so it's just sort of interesting for me to see this. But then it's also within the context of these camp photos, and you can see all these barracks back here. So they do these school photos in the yearbooks if you haven't seen them like that. And so when I took this photo, this is my nephew, Brandon. And when I took this photo, he was around the same age as my mom was when she was in camp. So I included it in this portrait, in this part of the book, to kind of make those connections between generations within similar ages, and kind of thinking about, if it happened today, So I asked him, so again, what would be something that would be meaningful to you that would be taken away you couldn't take away? And so this is at his time. He was heavily into these drones, and so he wouldn't have been able to take that with him, obviously. He's got a camera, it's like all this kind of stuff. And Japanese Americans weren't able to take cameras and other kinds of things to camp because it was like flight equipment or whatever. And so that's something that he would have to kind of leave behind. So these are some school yearbook photos of my mom's sibling, my Uncle Jimmy. He played football, so he's got a little bit of a football thing. And then my Auntie Sadie. And then this is her, I included her diploma. So she graduated in 1945. She graduated high school in camp. And so this is the diploma that she got. And it's Butte High School, Rivers, Arizona, signifying that this is Gila River. Because Butte was one of the smaller camps within the larger camp at Gila River. The other one was Canal Camp. So again, this is my Auntie Rosie, but now she's older, right? She's back from Japan. And she came back in, as I said, 1940. So then she came back in time to be incarcerated. That's what happened a couple of years afterwards. And so this is her at Poston. So prior to the war, right before, the summer before they were, not the war, but the summer before they were incarcerated, or that during 1942, she married my Uncle Yo here. And so she married into this other family, so she went with his family, and they went to Poston while the rest of her family went to Gila River. And so this is a kind of separation that starts to happen here. But this is in camp, and so I was asking her about this photo. I'm like, this looks kind of fancy, like this little pose thing. But someone in camp was taking photos, and you could, pay a little bit and get your photo taken, and this kind of thing. But she was telling me about that getting married that summer, and so she was saying how they didn't have time to go on a honeymoon, so their honeymoon was actually being shipped off to camp because there just was no time to do this. And so my Uncle Yo here, he enlisted in the Army and eventually graduated from the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling. And so he came to Minnesota, and he graduated in November of 1945. So he was late. It was after the war when he graduated. But there's a sort of an interesting story, too, that my Auntie Rosie told me about how prior to all of that, they were in camp at Poston, and they were both actually released from camp as part of resettlement, so they could leave. And during that time when they had left, he had decided to enlist in the Army. And so my Auntie Rosie was outside of camp, but she had nowhere to go. All her family members were in camp. So she was free, but she chose actually to go back to Poston, just so she could be with her family. But she had made it out, and then because he went into the Army and she couldn't go with him, then she just decided to go back. And so she went back to Poston and with his family. And so this is a photo of my niece Candace. And again, she's at the time that I took this photo, she was the age of my Auntie Rosie when my Auntie Rosie was incarcerated. So just trying to make these kinds of connections. And so I asked her again, what's something that you couldn't take with you that you would miss? And she said her dog Louie. And so that's another aspect of the incarceration where people couldn't bring their pets with them and they had to leave their pets behind. Only with weeks' notice of that they were even going to be shipped off and had to leave. And so just kind of making those preparations as part of this experience, things like that. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but on the upper left here is my Uncle Hiroshi. So he's the one that married my Auntie Sadie that I showed you earlier. And so he's here, and his family went to Hard Mountain. And so you can't see it here, but the Hard Mountain Peak is back there. And so he also worked in the mess hall, and that was his job. And so he's on the roof of the mess hall with his coworkers as he took this picture. And so it kind of provides a panorama. It looks better in the book, and kind of you can see the camp in the background. And so when I asked him about going to camp, he told me that he arrived at Hard Mountain on the day of his 16th birthday, in September 1942. And he said that it was actually snowing that day when they arrived at Hard Mountain. And so it was the first time that he had ever seen snow, because his family was from San Jose, California. So it's just sort of an interesting thing of like being shipped off on your birthday and this whole thing of it being snowing in the middle of September, which is just, kind of adds to that, thinking about that. Here is a photo of my Uncle Ike. So this is my mom's brother and Uncle Jimmy, who you saw earlier. And then, so this is just like a group of friends. So I was asking my Uncle Ike about what is this photo and what are the Hornets? It says Hornets up here. And he said, oh, it's like some sort of sports team. I was asking him, are you in a gang in camp or something? Well, they look, I'm not trying to, but they look kind of like they're up to trouble, right? Like they have their own little gang or something in camp. And he said, no, it's after a sports team. So I don't know what the truth is, but they don't look like they're playing sports there. And so he would tell me also just sort of stories about that, where they would, because this is in Jerome, Arkansas, and so they would sneak out of camp. This is when the security was a little bit less after they had been there for some time. They'd sneak out of camp and then just go swim in the local river. And then he was just telling me one time they got caught, so the MPs just came and just piled them up in the Jeep and just took them back to camp and that kind of thing. So just hanging out with friends. So this is my nephew Ben, who I photographed. And I photographed him in his college baseball. He plays baseball in college, and his uniform is workout clothes. As I wanted to kind of reference the popularity of baseball in camp among the Nisei, but then also just the tradition of Japanese-American baseball in the United States, which many people aren't even aware of, but it was an incredibly popular sport amongst Japanese-Americans during the war and the pre-war period as well. So I wanted to kind of just reference that, and he's part of that legacy, and sort of drawing connection to that. And again, just kind of thinking about things that, he would want to bring to camp but can't. This baseball bat is something they wouldn't have allowed him to bring. And there's stories, a lot of oral history kind of anecdotes of young children who would bring their baseball bat as a thing to just play, so they could play in camp, and then the military would confiscate it because they'd say, well, it's a weapon. And so they'd take the baseball bat away. Although they did have baseball in camp later, but I'm sure those were baseball bats issued by the camp itself, so they were starting to, after they were more comfortable with Japanese Americans being around, they realized that Japanese Americans posed no threat. And so started to relax their attitude a little bit. So this is a part of the book where I make the transition now to the present, and sort of signifies my journey and of discovery of this past and in search for this past, but then also some of my family members who are still alive and photographing them in certain ways in the present to make reference to their experiences in the past. And some of them are in photos that you've already seen previously. And so what this is a close-up of a government map of the layout of the camp of Jerome. So then this is part of my process where I'm showing my mom this map, and I'm like, where are your barracks, and where are you in a camp, and whatnot. And so she circled this thing here, signifying this is where it was. So it was a way of me figuring out where are you and where can I find it on the map, and then try to locate it later at the site. And so this is a photo that I found amongst her belongings, just buried in some closet, and a small photo she didn't even know she had. I found it after she had passed away. And it's of Jerome. And so these are the barracks here. And I'm not sure why. It's a real tiny photo. And she had it and must have forgotten about it because I had asked her about these images. Do you have anything? And it was just something that she had amongst her possessions. And so I included it. You can see in the book how small it is. So, this is a self-portrait where I'm trying to directly connect to this past. It's my attempt to kind of directly connect this past. So here, this is me standing at the spot of where her barracks were at Jerome 70 years later. And so that's why, I was going through the map, trying to find the location, and then find it at Jerome. And so this is approximately about where her barracks were. And in doing this, again, I'm trying to indicate that transgenerational connection to my mother's incarceration by placing myself where she once lived decades earlier. And also this sort of active pilgrimage going to these places and trying to get some sense of what that experience was like by being there, as much as I can. And so when I asked my father about where his barracks were at Gila River, he drew a layout of his block. So you can see here on a Post-it note. So I was like, so he just drew the block. It's like, oh, here are the barracks, and here's the mess hall, the kind of configuration, the basketball court, and then like the latrines and the laundry room and all of that kind of stuff. That's a kind of configuration. And then he circled on his thing where that was. And so I was able to then go, and like I did with my mother, I went to Gila River, and then was able to locate the location of where his barracks were. And then these are the footings. I photographed the footings is all that remains of where his barracks once stood. When his family was incarcerated. So again, this active pilgrimage in trying to make those kinds of connections. I also photographed my parents and uncle. So this is my mom and my dad, and then Uncle Hiroshi you saw earlier, and Uncle Ike we saw earlier as well. So I photographed them much more recently, and I did it in this mugshot style. And I did that on purpose because this is the kind of style of photographs that were used to document Japanese Americans who were in the camp for their IDs or for whatever they needed photographs for. So it was in this way of this kind of mugshot thing. So I wanted to do that again to kind of reference their incarceration past and then visualizing them all these years later and how that kind of connection stays with them. I also used it to kind of reference the Issei that were incarcerated and the older generations that were incarcerated at that time, because they would have, my aunts, my uncles and my parents would have been in that age of some of the eldest that were in camp, and sort of thinking about how those older people were criminalized as well, thinking, if there's some sense of there's some sort of danger to the public or something like that, and sort of visualizing the very elderly and thinking about, what kind of threat would they pose, and we all know that there was no threat at all from anybody, but especially from the oldest and the youngest, there would be no reason to even think that they would be some sort of threat. And so this is just a picture of my Uncle Hiroshi, and he's holding that picture that I showed you earlier, and that's him there. And then I just wanted to kind of use this contrast of who he was then, and then showing his old hands, many years later, of again drawing those kinds of connections between the past and the present. So this is my Auntie Rosie again. So you got to see her when she was very young, when she was in camp, and then this is her on her 94th birthday. And so I photographed her on her 94th birthday, and she was, this is the farm that her family owned, my dad's family owned, for 70 years. At least 70 years. And so I took them all there, and I photographed her in camp. I mean, not in camp, at the farm, to kind of reference that connection to the farm. But then also, it was just sort of interesting because these are the grape wires and things like that. So it was to me, it was kind of like the barbed wire fence in the background, and kind of sort of referencing that when I saw that as well, and sort of referencing these different aspects of her own history and experience. So in addressing the long afterlife of the incarceration experience and emphasizing that the experience didn't end when the camps closed, that it's this continuous, lifelong sort of dealing with this, I included a copy of one of the redress letters that my parents received several decades after their incarceration. So the redress included a public apology from the United States government, and then a cash disbursement. And just kind of in thinking about the long history of the long afterlife of the incarceration that the state of California announced, many of you probably know or are aware, the state of California announced that they will issue a formal apology soon for the incarceration of Japanese Americans. So you can see how these things unfold and how long it takes, and how it kind of, the reference keeps coming back to this experience after so many decades, that it's not just over when the camps close, and that it just continues on. And so Sally told me about this. I didn't know this because I had two different letters for my parents, and one of them is a white letter and it has a seal and it looks a lot fancier, and then there's this brown one that I actually kind of liked, and it's just sort of this depressing, stationary, and it's this brown thing. And Sally was telling me, I didn't know, because I was wondering, why are they different? And Sally was telling me these went out to some of the first people to receive a letter, and then there were complaints because it looked so minimal that they went back and they actually reissued the letter to make it look a lot nicer. But I kind of liked it on this just because it was raw, it's just sort of. So I picked this one instead of the one that maybe you're all more familiar with if you've seen it. So again, finding out from different people certain aspects of this experience and whatnot. I also took my parents to Manzanar, one of the camps in California, because it was the closest one. They lived in Los Angeles, and I took them there. And because I wanted to connect them visually to a camp setting, linking them directly to this experience in the past, all these years later. And so this is the first time that they had ever been to any of the camps in over 70 years since they were incarcerated. They never went back to visit anyone or did any pilgrimage. So it's just sort of a way of visualizing them in a camp setting, referencing their past. And so this is I just have two more images, and so this is towards the end of the book. where I use this. This is a headstone that was in the cemetery at Machi. And so it just sort of struck me, this, there were some headstones in there that had the names of individuals and things like this, but I ran across this where it says, "Evacuees unknown, rest in peace." So for me, that really hit me because I was starting to think about, and using this as a kind of way of referencing the sort of forgetting of this past. So whether it's forgetting of, American society forgetting about it, or it's not being taught enough in schools so people would remember, or whatnot, just sort of the forgetting of this past and what will happen to the memory of what happened when all those that went through it pass away and are no longer around to actually speak truth to what had happened to their own experiences, that sort of first-person testimony that is so powerful. And so, so that's kind of something that I always think about in terms of the incarceration experience. And so there's just this thing of like they're unknown, that they're unnamed, and that there are many that people have forgotten or don't know. And so just sort of playing on this idea, this last photograph in the book of the shadows of my parents at Manzanar, and I use it again to reference this sense of forgetting, of loss, of a kind of fading away. You don't see their faces, you just see their silhouettes. And as we get further and further removed from this past and kind of referencing this sense of the known become unknown. And so that's where the book ends. And so quickly I just want to do some acknowledgments because there are a lot of people to thank in relation to this project. I want to mention Peter, of course, and the Eastside Freedom Library for hosting this event. And my exhibit, but then also Peter and the Eastside Freedom Library provided funding for an earlier version of the book that I made that's presented today. So I thank Peter and the Eastside Freedom Library for that. I also want to thank the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, who have been very supportive of my work over the years and have sponsored many of the events that my work is shown at, including today's event. And I also finally want to thank the Minnesota State's Art Board for granting me an Artist Initiative grant, which allowed me to actually create the book and make copies of the book that are on display today. And so just a quick plug for my exhibit and book. So right over, back over here on a table are some copies of the book that you feel free to flip through and to look through. Also, I do have copies for sale, if anybody would like them. The way that I'm selling the books here today, I will eventually have it set up on my website. It's not ready yet because I just got the books, and then I'll sell them there. But for events here at Eastside Freedom Library, I'm selling them for $20. I want to really cut the price down. But then I'm also selling it $20 as a pay what you can, or pay what you like. So I really want this to be accessible and affordable to people. Not everybody has extra money for these kinds of things. So if someone, pay up to $20, or if someone is interested but is not in a position to pay, you can have a book for free. And so I just want to make sure that those that want a book can have a book, and that it's accessible to everybody, and that money shouldn't be an issue. And so also, if you want, take one of these postcards that has information about the book, and it's also got my website, so that eventually when I have it ready for books for sale, then you can go there and you can also purchase one later if you want to. All right, thank you. So our next speaker will be Karen Lucas. Let me get your PowerPoint up. So we'll have a moment for transition here. I just need to get out of.
Well, I am Karen Tanaka Lucas. I am a volunteer with the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, and I participated on their education committee. And I also would like to thank the Eastside Freedom Library for allowing us here to tell our story. My grandfather, Tsunejiro Tanaka, came to America in 1900 when he was 16 years old. Before, the 1907 policies blocked the immigration of Japanese laborers. And before the 1924 Race-Based Immigration Act halted all immigration from Japan, but continued to favor Northern European immigration. This is a photo of my grandparents shortly after they got married in 1913. By law, they could not become citizens or own land. They raised their family here. This photo was taken in the late 1920s, and that's my father there. Grandpa farmed in San Luis Obispo, California, near the coast until the war broke out. And you can't really make out this picture very well because of the light, but Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19th. And it was not, however, until March the 1st that the military exclusion zone was created. And this map is supposed to show that exclusion zone. Washington, Oregon, California, and the southern part of Arizona. There's actually the western parts of all of these states were what was called Military Exclusion Zone 1. And while this exclusion did not identify only Japanese Americans and could have been applied to Germans and Italians as well, Grandpa was quick to see the writing on the wall, and he left and took the family from San Luis Obispo, which was around here, inland to Cutler, which was in the eastern part of the state. He did this before March the 24th, when they started the military roundup of everyone of Japanese ancestry. And he did this before the March 29th, when leaving Zone 1 became prohibited. So this was the catch-22. Japanese Americans were prohibited to be in Zone 1, but they were not allowed to leave Zone 1. So it was a trap. This is my grandfather, and my father next to him, and his two brothers, before the war on the farm. Less than 10% of Japanese Americans made it out of Zone 1 before the forced rounding up started and the trap door closed. My grandfather was lucky to have friends who let them move inland onto their farm in Cutler. The family loaded major farm implements like the plow, the harrow, the disc onto their 1.5-ton flatbed truck, and also brought the family tractor to allow them to find work where they moved, and they abandoned everything else, including the team of horses. But when grandfather arrived in Cutler, he was arrested on March 13th. He was arrested by the FBI and taken away with no explanation. And I only found out 6 months ago when I started digging into the National Archives and Records Administration what actually happened to him back then. He ended up being taken to an INS detention camp. That's that Immigration and Naturalization Services detention camp near San Francisco. And the reason was that his kids went to an after-school Japanese language program, which he helped to support. While in INS detention, he wrote a letter of appeal to Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's probably too small for you to read, but this is a copy of my grandfather's handwritten letter, which is actually in the archives, and he addresses her as Her Highness, Mrs. Roosevelt. He affirms his loyalty to the government under which we live, as taught by Buddha. He writes, that, and I'll read a little bit of this since you can't make it out, but on this page, he writes that he was arrested at his friend's home in Tulare County and put in a Fresno County jail with other criminals by an FBI man. And he goes on that he had evacuated from San Luis Obispo in conformity with the command of the military. And he submits that in wartime like this, everybody must suffer and sacrifice, and we must do whatever the government wants to do. But he asked her to appeal to the president to take into consideration what I have done in the last 42 years in this country and give me an opportunity to show my best loyalty. I was actually surprised that he was as eloquent as he was, and when I read this for the first time, I almost felt like I was meeting my grandfather for the first time. You know, what really surprised me, though, is not the fact that he wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, but that he got a response. And Eleanor forwarded his letter to a man named Edward Ennis, who was one of the top attorneys in the Justice Department. Ennis's response reads on this letter, "Dear Sir, your letter of March 23rd has been brought to my attention by Mrs. Roosevelt. Ennis arranged for my grandfather to be given a hearing." Ennis also famously went on later to become president of the American Civil Liberties Union. My grandfather was cleared in the hearing. And again, I was surprised. I found his parole letter in his file, which was personally signed by U.S. Attorney General Francis Biddle. So my grandfather had a hearing, and he was paroled on June the 20th and released with the help of the First Lady and the Justice Department. He joined the family back in Cutler, only to be rounded up when the exclusion zone was suddenly and inexplicably expanded to Zone 2, the eastern half of the West Coast states. And on August 2nd, the entire family was sent to Poston, Arizona, one of the 10 World War II American concentration camps, where they would be held for the next 3 years. The family camera had been confiscated, and cameras were forbidden. So I have no family photos from this time period. But I'll tell you that Poston was on a Mojave Indian reservation. There were 1,200 Mojave Indians who remained after the decimation of war and disease. And they moved 18,000 Japanese Americans onto their reservation. Japanese American labor was used to level the land, to dig the ditches, to build the canals, and create an irrigation system so that after the war, the government could colonize their reservation with 10,000 non-related Indians who would be moved in after the Japanese left. My dad's older siblings, Henry and Helen, worked in the camp at salaries that were 10% of the outside wages. So my uncle was manager of the poultry division, and my aunt was a secretary in administration. And they were paid $16 a month, while a factory worker outside got $160 a month. A doctor in camp got $19 a month. An architect got $19 a month. Inmate labor made 500,000 adobe bricks that were used to build 54 school buildings for the Indian Service. They also made camouflage netting for the war. And I'll also add this point here, my mom's family was also imprisoned in Poston, but to keep the narrative a little smooth, I am just sort of focusing on one side of the family. But they also were in Camp 3 in Poston in a 7 people in a 20 by 24 foot room for the duration of the war. The only picture that I have from camp is of my grandparents' writing club. And I don't know who took this picture. Early on in camp, when cameras and photographs were prohibited, only WRA, or War Relocation Authority, commissioned photographers like Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange and Clem Elbers and Francis Stewart, and there were several, were authorized to take photographs. The goal was to portray camps as idyllic villages where patriotic internees waited the war out by farming, working, playing baseball, making arts and crafts, attending school, pledging allegiance to the flag. Photographs that were more sympathetic to the pain and anger, like the riots and strikes that went on in Poston, were suppressed. Lange's photos were relegated to the archives and not published until 2006 in her book called Impounded, which I brought a copy to show you, in case anybody wants to look at it. This photo has a caption on it that says 15 miles south of Poston, and it has a date of April 10th, 1945. So I saw this picture, and even a year or two ago, I was kind of confused of, why are they outside the confines of the camp? Did they escape or something? And then as I started reading more, it was December of 1944 when the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot hold someone in prison who's not been charged with a crime or had a trial. And in this country, it took them 3 years to figure that out. FDR rescinded his executive order at that time, and so technically by the time this picture was taken, they were free. While at Poston, Tsunejiro started to brood over all the 40 years of living in the United States and all the discrimination and injustice that he had experienced. He decided to ask for repatriation back to Japan. Well, when my father's whole family was locked up, Dad, ironically, as many of the men were, was in the U.S. military, having been drafted 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He was serving in military intelligence as a linguist in the South Pacific, interrogating POWs. My dad did all in his power to change Grandpa's mind. He talked to the Army's Judge Advocate section, the American Council in Brisbane, Australia. He wrote a letter to the State Department in Washington, D.C., and they sent a welfare representative out to Poston to talk to the family. My dad wrote to family friends and asked them to talk to Grandpa. But Tsunejiro, on what he declared would be his final letter to my father, cited an old samurai proverb which said, "When a tiger dies, he leaves his skin. When a man dies, he leaves his name." He said, "You, Walter, are a citizen of the United States. Serve your country with honor. Never do anything cowardly to bring disgrace and shame to your name. I, however, am a Japanese citizen, and the laws of the United States refuse me citizenship. This and the many abuses I've encountered over the years allow me no alternative but to seek repatriation to Japan. This is my last and final letter to you. Please forget me." Luckily, the war ended, and friends in camp led him to change his mind. When he left Poston, he had lost everything. His home, his livelihood, his possessions, and he was 62 years old. So the question that John posed us about, how has, our experience colored, given us the legacy now. And my trying to think of the answer to that is that it really is not so much what happened then that informs my seeing what is happening now, as what is happening now has somehow led me back to look and see more clearly at just what the heck happened to us. My people were banned from immigration too. My grandfather was in INS detention too. We weren't owned, but we were used as slave labor too. We were confined on a reservation too. This has reminded me of the reality that no matter how well you play by the rules, you may still be damned. It has reminded me that justice is conditional, and there are different sets of rules for different people. It reminds me how important it is to find and cultivate and support your allies, wherever or whoever they are, black or white, rich or poor, Democrat or Republican, and to be an ally to others. And just like the propaganda photos of the incarceration camps, the story is controlled by those in power. You need to dig deeper to find the truth and then to bring it open to air. Because it makes you stronger and it makes you smarter and it empowers you to be more than just a victim.
Okay. I also want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library for this opportunity. And I am going to actually feature my father. I'm Peggy Dory, by the way. And I have probably the latest addition to the JACL Education Committee. So, I think that. But anyhow, I'm featuring my father as an example of the Nisei, the generation, my parents' generation, and as an example of that group of people and what they've done. And this is my father, Saburo Bill Doy, and the influences that he had on himself and others. So he was born August 31st, 1916. In Washington State, Bothell-Woodinville area. They moved several times, rented property in his early life. And his dad worked on the railroad until his wife, my dad's mom, passed away in 1924. And so that left his dad with 4 children, 10, 8, 5, and 2. And so he stopped working at the railroad and was tenant farming so that he could be at home. The family was close. They helped each other. My dad remembers cooking dinner as a child. And my aunt, the 5-year-old, was really in charge of the 2-year-old. And she actually did not start school at 6 because she had to stay home and care for the baby. So life was difficult, but they were a close family. Dad was a good student. He graduated valedictorian from his high school class. Interesting enough, he received a 2-year scholarship to a community college, and the salutatorian won a 4-year scholarship to a university. And Dad's family was one of the few Japanese in that school. So after high school, Dad contracted tuberculosis. In those days, it was considered a stigma to have tuberculosis. And so he was in a sanitarium for a long time, and then he came home to recuperate on the farm. So he actually didn't start college. He applied to the Cornish College of Art in Seattle and was accepted. And so he moved to Seattle and worked as a chauffeur and a houseboy to pay for his schooling. And then he actually was in school only 2 years, and then Executive Order 9066 came out, and he returned home to be with his family. So the owner, a very wonderful man, told them that they could leave all of their, whatever they couldn't take in the house, and he would watch over it. However, it's interesting enough, the cottage caught fire somehow, And poor Mr. Scott, who was trying to keep things together, broke his hip trying to put out the fire. But now Dad and his family went to Pinedale Assembly Center, which was one of these interim ones that John and Karen were talking about, and it was a racetrack, so they lived in the stables. And then, so that was early in May, that was in May, and then in June, later in June of 42, they were moved to where the relocation camp, Tule Lake. And he was there until he enlisted in the service in November of 42. Mom actually was one of the groups that was actually moved directly to Tule Lake. And Mom was an office manager before, and she got one of the highest paying jobs at $18 a month. And she was in charge of registering people into camp. And of course she registered my dad. And they had met once before. So, and the rest is history. So this is Tule Lake, where Tule Lake was, where they were in Northern California. And I don't know, you probably can't see the coloration for the Zone 1, but this is some pictures of Tule Lake. This was not their barracks, but when I was there, I took some pictures. And just to show the size and what it looked like, and they had to build their own furniture and stuff their own mattresses, and that's the way they lived, with the guard towers, the barbed wire fences, and not great. So, as I said, Dad volunteered for the service, so I thought I'd let you hear him.
Why did you volunteer?
People thought that we were in America. We were, the enemy. We had to dispel that. No, I didn't particularly like being in camp either. Restricted. You knew you were restricted. You didn't belong there, and still there's no way that you could get out there. And you had what they call fire towers, and the only thing up there was guys, soldiers with guns, machine guns, pointing in the camp. And so it was just really a concentration camp. And then of course we felt that at least I felt that I wanted to show that I'm just as American as anybody. And that was one way to put it.
Okay, so Dad enlisted out of Tule Lake. Sadie Kumagai, whom some of you may know, actually was the recruiter that came out there. And the circled person there is my Uncle Tom, my mom's brother, and his daughter is in the audience here. Studied together. They were going to be given a proficiency test, so they did some studying while they were before they took the test, and Dad and my uncle, along with all of these other men from Tule, they passed and were enlisted in the Army. Dad said he thought the bar was pretty low. He said his first revelation that he was actually in the Army was when they were on the train on the way to Minnesota, and there were some derogatory remarks being made about the Japanese, this group of Japanese young men. And Stamey, who was in his uniform, said, "You need not to say those things. These young men are in the U.S. Army." So they arrived in Minnesota in November, dressed for California, and were transported out to Camp Savage in a canvas-covered open truck. So they were pretty cold by the time they got there. They were told by the people that were already there that they would get used to it. My talk, well, let me go through this. The study there was very intense. They had classes from 9 until noon, 1 until 5, 7 to 9, and of course then you have to study. So the only time, after lights out, the only place with lights was the latrines. So that's where they went to study. After 2 months, this was a 6-month program. After 2 months, there was somebody identified with tuberculosis in the camp. And so they actually x-rayed everybody in camp. And Dad, because he had had TB, had a scar. And so they misdiagnosed him as having an active case. So they put him in the sanitarium for 2 months before they decided he wasn't. But trying to catch up after being gone for 2 months in a 6-month program, he just couldn't do it. So they told him he could be in the next class. But in the meantime, they relegated him to special services. And when the next class came up, I guess he was doing such a good job that they said they really wanted him to stay there. So my dad's story about the military intelligence service is very different than most of the people there, because he was a non-combatant. But I feel his job was very important. As part of special services, this group started out as 2 people, one of those Dad, and ended up that their program was so big that they actually had 10 people later on. But their mission was to raise morale for these young men who were studying so hard. They really didn't have much time, and it was just hard work. And so one of the things they did was set up athletics. And Dad had actually done this at Tule Lake, set up athletics. So John, the Hornets probably were some kind of athletic team. But
where your father was a hood.
well, this is a different camp. But he set up athletic teams in every sport, from basketball to fencing to Golden Gloves. They had people who were Golden Gloves contenders, and he arranged them to play around the cities and around the state, and actually they did very well. And then the other thing was social kinds of things. And part of the Minnesota Nights, I think, Dad called the YWCA and asked if there would be some young women who would like to come out for a dance. And so they had a group of people they came in a bus, and of course they went back in the bus. So they had picnics. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting was that Dad, because these young men had no transportation to get off camp and all that, that to have a bank available to them instead of having to go downtown. So he called a number of banks to see if they would do on-camp banking. And the First National Bank actually agreed to bring out an armored car and to set up accounts for these young men and cash their checks, and later on actually to issue traveler's checks for them. So I thought that was a big deal. But other things that people actually volunteered. They would volunteer to have these young men come for a home-cooked meal at their home. And so Dad would, the group would arrange those kinds of things for just outings and for birthdays. And actually there were companies or people who would actually come out and offer to do work around the camp, to do landscaping and that sort of thing. Actually, GM, I believe, is one of the companies that sent people out there. So those kinds of things he didn't have to arrange. He just had to sort of, figure out when they would come. So, I never brought myself to ask him whether or not he regretted going overseas. But he received this commendation from the U.S. Army through Colonel Rasmussen, who was the one responsible for actually having MIS come to Minnesota. And this obviously was important to him because he actually bracketed this, but I'd like to read it to you. You sacrificed opportunities to join your comrades in combat zones and accepted your responsibility as a non-combatant. And the high morale of the men in the MIS language school in no small degree is due to your contribution as Special Services clerk. So, after after he got out of the service in 1947, he, under the GI Bill, he applied to the Minnesota College of Art and Design and was accepted there. He finished his 4-year degree coursework in 3 years while working at the post office, selling flowers on street corners, and having a family with 3 children. It's interesting he didn't receive his diploma until the 1980s, because at the time that he was going to school, if you didn't get a cap and gown and walk in the exercises, you didn't graduate. So Dad happened to be sitting on a committee, and I think it was for the committee to look at bringing Asian studies to the University of Minnesota. But anyway, he was sitting next to the then dean of MCAD. And she said, you know, if I can find your records, would you like to have your diploma? And he said, oh, yes, he would. And so she found his records and sent him his diploma. And he was so proud of it. It was framed and hanging in the back room where he kept all his precious things. So he worked as a commercial artist, as an art director first, and ended with it being an art production manager through his professional life. So, as far as the effect of the incarceration on Dad personally, he said he felt of his dad that he he was the breadwinner, he was the head of household, he kept, family going, and of course once they came into camp, that was all gone. All of those kinds of things were run by the people who ran the camp. And so they were relegated to a position that they were never used to being in. And Dad always felt, and said that he felt the family unit was harmed by incarceration. And because, kids went off and they ate dinner with their friends, and there wasn't a family unit. People went off and did their own thing. And it left these Issei with a real feeling of emptiness. And I know it was really hard on them. So, and after returning home, most of them were too old to start over. And so they continued to do nothing, or at least in our grandfather's time, that he lived with my aunt and uncle, and actually was sort of the daycare person for my cousin, who she said, he's such a gentle man. Although every now and then she would get a coton on her head. But he was a gentle man, and she loved him for that. So, let's see. Dad said that he wasn't sure that he would have actually agreed to go be incarcerated if it were to happen today. But at that time, he agreed, and he went, as most people did. So, but he really felt that he had to see if he could make sure that this doesn't happen again. And so he was involved in a lot of things, and he was against the war in Vietnam. He just felt in his own heart that it couldn't be justified. What was happening there could not be justified. And so he actually joined a group of 30 people who drafted this report. And let me see if I can read this. The Peaceful Solution, Report of the People's Commission on Inquiry to the End of the War in Vietnam. And this group actually went to France to meet with the delegation, the Vietnamese delegation that was there, and presented this document. And obviously nothing happened, but they felt compelled to do this. And Dad actually, I passed out flyers and things downtown Minneapolis on his lunch hour, and he went to a march to Washington, D.C. to protest the war. And actually, it was interesting, a friend of his who knew Vice President Walter Mondale got the FBI report on him, or the family. And among other things, we found that our phones were bugged. So, but he also worked on the Title II Repeal Committee in 1966. He marched with Father James Grappi, a civil rights person, to gain fair housing for blacks in Milwaukee. And later on, he was the initiator of the Minnesota Nikkei Project, which provided social kinds of events for the Issei. And now our generation, Rosie's there, and we're still continuing on and trying to do that for our parents' generation. And Dad continued to work for civil rights and human rights for people all his life. He also, so as far as education, it was very important to him, and he did a number of different things. And for instance, he gave over 200 presentations around the state as part of diversity training, or then continuing ed for teachers and others on incarceration, and to hopefully instill in people that this should never happen again. And so he was on a number of different committees. I mentioned the one for the Asian Studies at the university. He wrote letters for congressmen, and one of the ones that we have is from Congressman Illinois. And he wrote articles for the PC, the Pacific Citizens, the Japanese American Citizens National paper, and local papers. He was also the Midwest representative to the National JCL committee that actually drafted the redress proposal to be presented at the National Convention. So that's sort of Dad at a high level. But on a personal level, I just like to have you know him a little bit. He was frugal, he was detail-oriented, and he was a little bit, maybe OCD. For instance, he kept the high and low temperatures for every day on a calendar. And he kept all the calendars so you could compare back and forth. My sister-in-law, who was sitting in the audience, said she asked Dad about a shirt he was wearing, and being really nice or something, and so she asked him where he got it or something, I'm not quite sure, but he pulled his shirt around, and that was when you had tags, and it said where he got it, who he got it from, and when he got it. So that was Dad. As a family, person, he was as a husband. Mom and Dad wrote to each other every day when they were separate. They did different things. They went their own way. But they were so close, and so they would write every day while they were gone. And they just liked being together. They would. In fact, they had 2 televisions in the living room because they didn't like the same program. So Dad would listen with earphones, and Mom would listen. But they could sit next to each other on the couch and hold hands sometimes. So they were well traveled. They traveled all over the world together. And later on, Dad was caregiver for Mom when she couldn't do as many things. So. And then, of course, he was the father of 5 children, and so we did things as a family. He felt, as we go back to camp, when we didn't do things, they didn't do things as a family, that we needed to do things as a family. And he was a disciplinarian, obviously, but he was fair, although I'm not sure I always thought so at the time. But, we had our chores and that sort of thing to do. And as far as the effect on me, I think early on, Mom and particularly Mom to me would talk about camp and her early life and that sort of thing, but we never got the emotion. And so even though I remember giving a talk in high school or something about the incarceration, I think the emotion wasn't there until later when I read more and heard more about what was happening and the humiliation and fear that they all felt, but they didn't tell that to us. So, but so the effect, particularly on me, was later on. And hopefully I joined the JCO Education Committee and hope at some point in time, if I can get my act together, to give some of these presentations, to tell the story, and to hope that it never happens again. My brother Dave, who is also in the audience here, is definitely our father's son. And even though he told me he can't feel that the effect of the incarceration directly, but he was his father's son. And it obviously rubbed off on him. And he was an activist in college, and he would spend his professional life in the nonprofit sector. He was the director of law enforcement relations for the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, and he was executive director of coordination for juvenile justice, and currently he is working on executive director for trying to see that the poor are able to stay in their homes and they're safe. So he definitely is his father's son. And this is my sister, Dee Dee, who is also here, and this is her story.
When I was in 3rd grade, I remember a classmate, Deborah, coming up to me one day and saying, "Your mom and dad were in a concentration camp." I was horrified and vehemently denied it. When I got home from school, I told Mom what Deborah said, and she looked at me and said, "Yes, we were." I was shocked. This was not the answer I was expecting. I remember walking away from her not asking any questions and feeling so ashamed. Looking back, I'm thinking, how bad is that I felt ashamed. Mom and Dad never really talked about camp when we were growing up. When I got older, I did ask a couple questions and they would answer the question, but not go into much detail. In high school, I did a term paper on the Japanese internment camps, which I think most Senseis did, and I interviewed Mom and Dad. They answered all the questions I had, but again, did not go into any detail. They spoke with very little emotion. The first time I realized what an impact it had on Dad was when I attended one of the sessions he gave to the Minnesota teachers as part of their required continuing education. Recently, it would have probably been called diversity training. He spoke very openly and with so much emotion about the war and his experience with camps in F. Towards the end of the session, he had an 8mm film on the Japanese internment camps. He told the group that he would start it, would leave, and then come back when it was finished because he could not bear to watch it. This had a huge impact on me. This was the first time I had ever seen Dad speak so openly and to see so much emotion, and it really hit me how much the whole experience affected him. Mom and Dad always told us that people would remember what we did because we looked different. So whatever we would do, it had to be good or better than anybody else, whether it was in school, playing, working, just everything in life. This was drilled into us at a very early age.
So that's really the end. I just thought I would show some pictures of Mom and Dad, and thank you. And Dad also, he was an avid golfer, started golfing at 71. Golfed until, I think this picture was probably taken when he was 100. And he he liked the Vikings, and so he actually was one of the guests at Vikings, and he wanted to see the new stadium, so he got to sit on the field, and that was very special to him. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience on the last of your long lineup of speakers. I will not personally take that as a commentary. What's this? I think you can all agree, as I listen to everybody's stories, thank you so much for sharing them. But as I look around the audience, there's so many people here who have the same stories, and they're all very strangely similar, but they're all very unique in their presentation, and they have very personal stories. Well, my name is Todd Tachia, and I guess the direction I'd like to take, or the lens that I would like to speak on, is not, this whole experience is commonly looked through the lens of the racial side of things, the Japanese Americans. I'd like to address or talk about is the religious side, and how being Buddhist was viewed in America, and the religious persecution that really is not addressed as much as the racial side of it. I'd also like to just talk about why maybe the Buddhist community as well is here in the Twin Cities. So a little bit about my background. My parents are both in the internment camps. My mother's side was in Gila, as John's family was. We have very similar stories. My father's side was first in Jerome, then Tule Lake as well, and is just through some crazy sequence of events also. My father and grandfather were in Santa Fe and Bismarck in the Justice Department camps as well. But just to tell you a little more about my family's background, my mother's family lived in Parlier, which is in the Central Valley of California. I'm not that familiar with the geography of California. But this is a picture of them as they were being taken from their home to the train station. So their neighbor had helped them load up things in the back of their truck to take them, and took a picture. An uncle on both sides of my family, my mom's side and my dad's side, were both stationed at Fort Snelling. And so this is a picture of my uncle on my mom's side, who had actually visited them. He was at Fort Snelling, so he was in his military uniform, and he visited them in their camp in Gila. There was a lot of discussion about the access to cameras, and my mom was had a very unusual and unique situation. She worked as a secretary for the school principal in camp. So the school principal had a camera to take photos for the yearbooks, as John showed pictures of his mom's yearbook. My mom took the pictures. So the principal said, "Here, Helen, take this camera, take as many pictures as you can for the yearbook." And the extra pictures that she took, he said, "Keep them." So she has a lot of pictures of life in camp, portrayed a lot as was described before as, the idyllic life of happiness and sports, and things are really hunky-dory there. But she did have that access, which we do have a very wonderful keepsake in our home of pictures that she has taken. My father's family is from a nearby town from my mom. They didn't know each other back then. He was from Fowler, and they were first, as I mentioned, placed in Jerome. But I had a chance last year to go back to that general area, and this is actually in Fresno. So the county fairgrounds in Fresno, there's a memorial there, a monument there. If you ever have a chance to go, it's very nice. It's in the fairgrounds. The fairgrounds are a permanent structure, kind of like the fairgrounds here. And it's a dedicated area specifically for all the people who were incarcerated there at some point. So my father's family did go there first before they went on to the Jerome. And in this particular memorial monument, all the names, as I said, are listed on plaques. So I was able to find my family, so to see the list of Tsuchiyas there. So my grandfather, grandmother, and uncles are all listed there. So I first want to say, speaking about the Buddhist side, my background is I'm a Buddhist minister in the Jodo Shinshu tradition. And the Jodo Shinshu tradition originates from Japan. It's the part of the organization, the institution here in the U.S. is very intertwined in the whole Japanese American immigration experience as well as the camp experience. It's a second career for me. I look around the room here and see so many familiar faces, people I know and connected to. Had an opportunity to reconnect with a dental school classmate of mine. I'm a retired dentist. And ends up that she was Mr. Doy's dentist as well as golf partner, right? So that tells you how interconnected we are in the world. But anyway, so I have a little bit of background on the Buddhist side of that, but I'm certainly not an expert. But I do want to bring to your attention to the handout I just gave you was given to me by Carolyn with the JACL. And this is announcing a visit in 2 weeks is Professor Duncan Williams, who is a professor at USC. He came out with a book entitled American Sutra. It just was published in February of last year. And so collaboration of groups, including the JACL and the University of Minnesota, I know Yuichi was here, he may have stepped away. They're sponsoring and hosting an event, so it's in your handout. And but this is with him giving a talk on that Thursday, March 5th. Also on that handout is the announcement of a book discussion group that's gathering at Oxford College prior to his visit to discuss the book. So if you have an opportunity to read the book, I think this book is being donated to the library here. It's a very interesting direction to look at the whole experience, a little different from what we've been used to. This just gives a little bit more information about Duncan Williams' background. He is an ordained Zen Buddhist priest. He is, I think his mother is Japanese, father from the UK, grew up in Japan. But very notable author and very well versed, and his book is very fascinating. A little bit more about the Buddhist side. The Shin Buddhism, or the sect of Buddhism that I'm involved with, first arrived in Hawaii in 1889, and then in the U.S. in 1898 on the West Coast. And most of the immigrants came from parts of Japan where this form of Buddhism was most prominent. And I think one of the interesting things I read about is the interesting patterns of Japanese immigration to the U.S. during this period is that there are, at least in this particular publication, they said 4 prefectures from southwest Japan in Hiroshima, Yamaguchi, Kumamoto, and Fukuoka account for nearly 80% of the immigrants who came to the U.S. And Jodo Shinshu Buddhism was the most prevalent in those areas. So this is a very bad scan, very bad copy, but it is from the San Francisco Chronicle announcing their arrival in 1899. So this population that immigrated requested to have priests to be sent by the home institution, which is located in Kyoto, and they wanted them to come to serve this particular community. And so this, institutionally, this first group to form was the it was called the Buddhist Mission of North America. And it's a long-standing Buddhist organization that's actually still in existence. So let's see, the 10-year anniversary, so early 1900s, the organization had grown to a total of 20 temples in 3 states along the West Coast. And the Japanese American community at that time, as I said, was mostly Buddhist. And a survey that I looked at, a 1930 survey, estimated that 78% of all Japanese immigrants claimed Buddhist identity as compared to 18% claiming Christianity. And most of the temples, as I mentioned, were mainly along the West Coast. not all Buddhists were Shin Buddhists. There were other sects of Buddhism, and they established themselves in a similar manner. This is the Paul Air Temple where my mother was when she was a child. I couldn't find my mother in that photo, but my aunt is in that particular one. Now these temples were also community centers, as refuges or safe havens to escape the discrimination that was occurring at that time. And of course there were Japanese language schools there in these temples to teach the children. Now by the beginning of World War II, that Buddhist Mission of North America, that organization, expanded from the one church in San Francisco to now 46 temples across 6 states. And in terms of the membership, the initial membership was 30 members in 1898, and then by World War II it was up to 12,000 members. This is a photo of my father's family's temple, very simple looking building, and we had a chance to go visit there, my brother and my cousins and I, and to actually, we had pictures of my father and his brother standing in front of this building, so we were able to kind of recreate our photos there. And it's now modernized, so across the parking lot, which I didn't take, is a more modern version of their temple in Fowler being a very small town. Now prior to the war, the FBI had been monitoring activity in the Japanese American community, including the language schools and the Buddhist communities. And the Buddhist priests were especially considered a threat to national security. It's because of their use of a foreign language and promoting a foreign religion. Buddhism was often equated with Shintoism, which is more of a state religion, so there was not a consideration for any differentiation. Everything was just grouped into one. So, being Japanese was not regarded well, but being Japanese and Buddhist was even worse. So, in 1942, the survey of the population that entered the camps said that 68% of all internees claimed to be Buddhists. And I thought that was interesting. It's kind of keeps creeping downward. And the statistic, one interpretation of the statistic was that since being Buddhist was considered not un-American, and Buddhists were very concerned about retribution, so many who had to write down and register what they were going to camps changed and said something else just for that fear of retribution. So that statistic, whether it's true or not, it's hard to really know. So being Buddhist was viewed by the U.S. government as racially and religiously different from the majority of the U.S. population. So, they were viewed as anti-American and a national security threat. And in fact, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the very first person, as Duncan Williams talks about in his book, the very first person to be arrested was Buddhist clergy. And Japanese American Christian leaders were not treated in the same manner. So that tells you that religion was definitely the basis for this discrimination. And the arrests were quick to occur because there was that registry I talked about that was maintained by the FBI to monitor the religious leaders. Now, the Buddhists lost many of their ritual items, things that were considered suspicious, anything with Japanese writings on them. It was looked at with suspicion, so many burned them or did not take them to the camps. This is a photo on the top of the San Francisco Buddhist Church, a current photo. And this is a stupa. In Buddhism, stupas are built to house the relics of the Buddha. So my Buddhist 101 5-second version here is when the historical Buddha died 2,500 years ago, he was cremated. And so the followers took parts of the cremated remains and split them up to build stupas for places to worship. And so in the 1930s, the king of Siam gave a portion of these relics to the U.S. organization. So they built this stupa. And I've heard stories of, this is in the 30s, so I've heard a story that a minister took those remains, didn't want to leave them there during the incarceration, so took them and hid them somehow, and they were able to reconstruct the stupa later. And of course, when I heard the story about the king of Siam giving it, I always thought, well, what's the old runner doing in that? Different methods. Anyway, so a story about how Buddhism was looked at. One of my uncles, I heard it more recently, had the opportunity to leave camp early. He was able to come to Minnesota. And the reason Minnesota was a focus, as I said, was one of his brothers was stationed here at Fort Snelling. And he had an opportunity to come here. He had a sponsor, work at a farm. But there's one stipulation he was told. You can come here, we'll sponsor you. You have to convert to Christianity. So it was not, it wasn't just a national, government-sponsored thing. It was, of course, pervasive throughout the community. And of course, he was very willing to do so. He wanted to get out of camp and be able to come work in Minnesota. So Buddhists were allowed to practice their religion in camp, but it was a little more difficult with the lack of materials and the lack of ministers. Many of the ministers were in Department of Justice prisons. So this is a photo of one of the external building and what they used as a Buddhist temple or Buddhist church. And there were also Caucasian clergy that were able to help that traveled from the outside. One of the challenges in accommodations was that there are many different sects or types of Buddhisms, and that wasn't accommodated for. So there was a movement within the camp to accommodate that. So there were ritual changes to make the worship a more ecumenical, so to speak, form of Buddhism, or more universal to accommodate all the different traditions so that they could worship together. So that made it kind of awkward, I think, from a tradition standpoint. If you can imagine if you group all Christians together and say, you got to figure out how to worship one way, it would be a challenging thing. Another change institutionally was the Buddhist Mission of North America, as I mentioned to you, that started in 1900 roughly. During this time, they met, of course the organization was really non-existent because of the encampment, but they organized at Topaz in Utah, and they reorganized, making it more American. So they moved the leadership towards the next generation, which is the Nisei generation, made it more English-speaking, and they changed the name to Buddhist Churches of America. And that's the name, institutional name that it goes by today. This is a picture my mom was also in Gila River, same as John's family, but in a different camp, the Canal Camp. So this is a picture that she took with her camera. So this is a picture that we have in the scrapbook of the particular Buddhist altar there. This is a young person's organization. There were youth organizations that were very prominent in that period, but they tried to continue that on in the camp. This YBA, I think, stands for Young Buddhist Association or something like that. So. This is a photo of a Buddhist funeral for 3 soldiers that were killed during the war. And what struck me is this is a funeral held outside. So my mom had a series of photos. So the next one was showing the families with the military son who had been killed in the war. And the reason it was outside was how many people attended. Really pretty much everybody in camp, or most people in camp, did attend. So they had to make those accommodations for that type of service. In the Buddhist families, home altars are very important. And my parents' families didn't take their Buddhist altar with them to camp. And so my grandmother was actually was an educated teacher, kind of unusual in that particular era of Issei. She kept very detailed correspondence and writings, and one of her relatives compiled it all into a family history book for us. And it was always in Japanese, so until my uncle fairly recently translated it to English, I was able to start to read it and hear my grandmother's voice in all of that history. And she talked about that they weren't able to take their Buddhist altar, but that a family friend had found scrap pieces of wood and made an altar for them in camp. So why is there a Buddhist group here? It's very unusual for the Joshinshu community to be in the middle of Minnesota, and really it's related to the fact of Fort Snelling. So with a high concentration of Japanese Americans at Fort Snelling and Camp Savage, there was a Father Daisuke Kitagawa, which I think many of you may recognize that name. He was a civilian Episcopal chaplain And also a person helped, I know he helped many relocate to the Twin Cities. And so he encouraged the members to organize the Buddhist group. And they reached out to a minister in Chicago, Reverend Kono, who agreed to help them. Now this Reverend Kono, just a quick story, he was very interesting background. He's from Japan. He was imprisoned in Rower in camp, and he was allowed to relocate to Chicago a little early in 1944. But to establish a community there, he was very highly scrutinized by the FBI. So he had to have he had to report regularly, and he also had to have all of his sermons reviewed before he could give them by the FBI. So our organization here started in 1946 with 46 members, mostly through the connections with Fort Snelling. And this is a picture in a historical reference book about our organization. The first services on the bottom you can see was held at the WWCA. And then a Unitarian church stepped in and gave them facilities. But then those of you long-timers here will remember there was a Japanese American Community Center of Minnesota. And it was, I believe it was purchased by the Episcopal Diocese, is that right? And I know that was a very important gathering place for cultural and social gathering place. This, I'm sorry, it's hard to read, but this is the first, I found the copy of the first 1946 bylaws of our organization with all the signatures. And you might recognize some names in there if you could see it. For instance, Hisa Nishimura is Hisa Osada, if you know those people, that the Hirota family, the Inari family, Gales here, their parents were part of that. So, just some early pictures to show you of the organization back in the day. There was a young people's group in the right photo there. See Gail's parents, the Inaris are in there. George Ono. Gosh, a lot of names on. This is must be a dinner party. Reverend Kono's right in the middle there. My father and uncle. This is Gail, Frank Inari, Tom Kosobayashi, my uncle Al Tsuchiya, Susie Hirota. Many familiar faces to many of you who've been around a while. The children's group, and my brother and sister are in there. Gila, are you in there? No. I wasn't born yet. Al Ono. Anyway, and there are newspaper clippings. This is from the 50s. This is Reverend Kono in front of the altar just talking about the Buddhist worshiping in Minnesota. This is an article that shows our religious leader, Shigtu Saki, with Father Otani. So this was at the particular community center, and it shows that how the two groups were able to worship in the same room. And so you can see the picture of the cross on the top with the Buddhist altar on the bottom. And this was actually shared by multiple organizations that were very cross-cultural as well. So it's unfortunate that it's not there anymore, and I don't know the circumstances of the financial change that made that go away, but before I was born. I threw this in just for the fun of it. Our Buddhist group organized Obons, which is the fall festival to honor the deceased. But this is our last speaker. Thank you, Jordan. So, what is it about my family history is the kind of focus of what we're all talking about that has informed me to become maybe sort of more socially active or socially aware. I had an opportunity to go on a pilgrimage with my mother when she was still alive. This was 20 years ago in 2000. My wife, our son, and I went, and this is at Gila. So in the left photos, this is Casa Grande. This is now a abandoned train depot, and my mother remembered getting on the train from the assembly center. This is where they were dropped off. So she did remember that that being the trained people. And going to visit, any of you, whether you have family history or not, to go on a pilgrimage or to go to these sites is just transformative. To walk on the same grounds and to really understand the history from the historical trauma and really what the land holds, still holds, I think, to this day. But in Gila particularly, it's a Native American reservation. It's on a Pima reservation that you can't just go and say, I think I'll go drive down there and check it out. So it was an arrangement that was made through the local JACL and the Native American organization, the group that was part of the reservation. And this is at the Butte side where John's family, I think, was and there's a monument there. So these are various artifacts and things that are on the ground. So what happened after the camp was closed is the structure were all taken away, the hardware and things were all taken away, but they left a lot of the foundations and the artifacts. So there's things around there that are still memories, and so there are numbers of cement foundations. Very fascinating. My mother could walk up and say, this was where the mess hall was. And so this photo is her saying, this is my barracks. She remembered where that was, and then I think all of those who our families who were there could have very vivid memories of the locations and the geography of the camps. But I think this is also a story about racial and religious persecution and the use of the World War II experience as a model today, unfortunately. And so this is not meant to be political statements, but just things that we're involved with and I'm involved with. This is an organization called ICOM, which is an interfaith community on immigration. And they hold vigils, amongst many things. They hold vigils at the Whipple building, at the federal building by Fort Snelling. And it's an area that has accompanied immigrants to detention, or they bring in immigrants that are being tried for detention. The ICE offices are there as well. And so this was a vigil that was run by the Buddhist Coalition of Buddhist Community. The vigils tend to be a little shorter when it's -7. Yeah. And this is a photo of the detainees being brought in by van. I do want to bring up one last organization before I close, and this is an organization called Sudo for Solidarity. It's a national organization. It's an allied group within the Japanese American community that includes many Buddhist communities as well. And it's also supported by JACL. And this is a vigil that was held at Fort Sill, which is a historical, was it detention center?
Department of Justice.
Department of Justice site. And this is a vigil that was led by the Buddhist community. This is Duncan Williams, who will be speaking in a couple weeks here. This is also, and there's many different sects of Buddhism represented here. It was a very eclectic group of people that came together. This individual here is Reverend Briones. He's a Jodo Shinshu minister in our tradition. Interestingly, his background is his ancestors are Mexican American. And this person here his name is Ted O'Toole. He's actually a Zen priest from Minneapolis. So this tells you a little bit more about Sudo for Solidarity. If you're interested, very easy to find on websites and social media and some of their actions. I won't read that for you as we're getting a little bit long here. And this is the protest or the activity at Fort Sill. And it was a group that consisted of Latinx Dreamers, American Indian Movement, Black Lives Matters. It was organized by an organization called United We Dream. And so Fort Sill, as Auntie Sally there said, was a prison for Japanese during World War II. And the current administration was going to place 1,400 separated children there last summer. So that's why this protest was organized. And then the administration, whether it was due to this or not, changed their mind. So they are no longer going to use that. And this is the Buddhist group
they held a service and vigil there. They have a vigil or a gathering coming up. They're calling it the Close the Camps in Washington, D.C. on June 5th to the 7th. And lastly, to close, I just want to read something that is part of the vigil, the Buddhist-led vigil in the Whipple building at Fort Snelling. I was asked to speak, so this is just a small segment. If I could just read this to you, this kind of informs why I feel so involved. Historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, all the things that all the other speakers spoke much more eloquently than I can, spoke about as a very real thing. And so this is what I had said. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. government imprisoned all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast without due process, no matter whether they were U.S. citizens or not. This included adults and children. There are parallels of this wartime incarceration to what is happening today. Back then, people were complicit and allowed it to happen. We cannot stand by to watch these mistakes in history be repeated. We are here in solidarity with all of you to fight against the dehumanization of immigrants, separation of children from their families, indefinite detention, and inhumane treatment. So, thank you.
If I could just mention I forgot to mention that actually this is my dad, and this is, and if you want to look at that, the paintings in the back are Dad's paintings, and actually there are some memorabilia from Tule Lake on this table over here. So if you'd like to look at those things, they're around for your viewing.
So now's the time for questions and answers. And we have everyone up here. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I had the same experience as a lot of the speakers, is that my parents would not talk about the camps, and I found out about it sort of third hand, but I would like any of the speakers to address, she got the kanat, it's nothing you can do about it, and my parents, my mom especially, would say that, and would even say, well, it was a good thing because otherwise we'd all be on the West Coast now. We were in Chicago, and so she's trying to make it nice as possible. And then when Guantanamo Bay, the prison there opened for after the storm, she got very, very upset. So I knew there was more to it, but she would never talk about it. So this.
Well, I think I remember talking with Mom. We would sit across the counter and talk about a number of things. And she would talk about camp, but there wasn't a lot of emotion. I mean, she said it was very dusty, and one time she had a dreamsicle in her hand and one of these sand gusts, and she put the whole thing in her mouth, but so that it wouldn't get all sandy. But we really didn't get the feeling of the emotion that went with being incarcerated. It was more or less, it happened, and it happened, but very little emotion.
I'll just add one thing. My dad was not in camp because he was in the military. My mom was one of the people who was fortunate to get a job and have an accepting place where she could go and was able to get out of camp early. But the people who are, that we know the best, our parents, were teenagers when they were in camp. And the teenagers in camp didn't have as much to lose as their parents, who lost a huge amount. Not only their dignity, but a lot of property loss and stuff. And the teenagers, I've heard from some that, here you had Japanese American communities that were very rural and very separated, and all of a sudden now they're all congregated together in a camp where you got thousands of people, and the young people now had dances and parties and could so at least there were other kids they could socialize with, and they spent their dinners, hanging out with their friends. I don't know that it was as psychologically traumatizing, to them, and that may be one reason why they don't talk about it as much. But my grandparents, unfortunately, by the time I got old enough to develop an interest in it, were no longer around to ask questions. So.
Yeah, just two things kind of connecting with the way you were asking and what others have said. When I was interviewing my parents and my uncles and aunts and things like that about what had happened, it is that sort of the recollection. They were very willing to talk, but it was very matter of fact. This is what happened, this is what it was like, but that emotion or the anger or any of that kind of thing didn't really come across. Although they would clearly speak, yeah, it was wrong and we were only rounded up because we were Japanese and these kinds of things. But it is that lack of emotion, and at least from my experience with my own family, that was always a little frustrating in terms of trying to come to terms with it. Also, my mom would even say to me, she's like, I hate to admit it, but I had a lot of fun in camp, because she was a little kid. She was, on the cusp of being a teenager, and so she didn't have the burden of, what do we do with the family? How do we support a family? All those kinds of things that the Issei had to deal with, and so they weren't struggling with that. So it was always, and that was always hard for me, because as I was trying to understand what had happened, when she says something like that, I'm trying to reconcile her own experience as a child to what was in camp and what it meant to her, versus sort of my understanding of the whole broad history and what had happened to everybody. So it was always that kind of disconnect in terms of trying to reconcile both of those aspects of it.
I think our dad was older, because he was in his 20s by this time, and so it affected him. Mom and Dad were both in their 20s, and so they were not children when they went into camp. And so I think it affected them more, but it didn't make them talk about it anymore. They really kept it in. And they would talk about things that I remember, whether it was Mom or Dad, saying that an Issei man was trying to get this little dog that was running around the camp, and he was dead. And he went too close to the fence, and he was told to get away, and he was shot. So there were those incidences that I would hear about, but so it's only later that I felt that I could see that the fear. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if they would ever come back. So it was tough.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you. My grandparents, mother, and her siblings were all in prison in Manzanar. And they're all dead now. So I don't have anybody to ask questions of. My mom was the last one to have a family, so all my first cousins are 80. And they're much older than I am, and they're starting to leave the planet. I recently obtained a copy of my grandfather's alien registration file from the National Archives, and I shared it with my family members that are alive. And the first cousins, I have to tell you, they have been telling family stories for so long that they believe that a lot of the things they say are the truth. But my grandfather's file contradicts quite a few stories that have been told. And I have some family members now that refuse to talk to me. And I'm just wondering if anybody else has had a similar situation where, you get documentation and it doesn't support the mythology. So it's a complication that I was completely blindsided me. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say I did the same thing. I got someone found for me my grandfather's alien registration number. That's what opened up the file. And my father had always told us that my grandfather had been arrested and taken to a Department of Justice camp in Santa Fe, and he was there maybe for a year, and then I get this file, I go, what? in INS in San Francisco. So yeah, it was different. Because they didn't tell them anything. I mean, they were arrested. When they're arrested, whoosh, they're off. And nobody's told where they're taking them, whether they're going to be shot or not, how long they're going to be gone for. There was no information. So the misinformation had to have been huge. You had to kind of make up what happened to explain it.
I don't have a personal story of this, but I recall when you were asking that, I was recalling something I had read that the historian Roger Daniels, who's written a lot about Japanese American incarceration, he has a story of how in the 60s he was teaching about the Japanese American incarceration, and he had some Japanese American students, and they were doing some sort of project talking about family history and how in the early 1940s the parents were born in Southern California. And he said, well, knowing that they all would have been incarcerated at that time, questioned and said, no, that doesn't sound right, that can't be. So the students went back to their parents and asked them, what's the real story? And then they found out that their parents were born in camp and all of this thing, but the parents didn't actually tell the children about it. They had a different story of where they were born, when, and all that kind of thing. But because it clashed with the actual historical information of the incarceration, then that led to sort of a revealing of the actual family history. So there's these kinds of things go on. Yeah. Yes?
Since Manzanar has been mentioned a couple times, the Japanese American community in Los Angeles has an annual pilgrimage to Manzanar every spring, the end of April, which I went to last year. My father, who was of German descent, was actually he volunteered with Caltech to work with the USDA. Maybe familiar, they used WWII to develop rubber out of the plant. And that whole project was classified when the war ended for political reasons. But the University of California, Berkeley has now picked up on that research because the WWII polymer doesn't contain the protein that makes people allergic to latex. So some of the work that went on during World War II is being picked up again. You talk about kind of history moving along. But I would recommend, if you're interested, Manzanar, if you've been there, there's a number of buildings that were rebuilt. And there's actually people that go to the pilgrimage that were there, and I've walked through the buildings with some of the people that live there. And it's actually the only National Historic Site of all the Japanese American internment camps in the United States. And there's an interpretive center, and the Park Service actually staffs people there. And if you have any family documents like I had, they're more than willing to take documents to put in their interpretive center of interest at Manzanar.
Yeah, the pilgrimage at Manzanar, if you have an opportunity and interest to go, is the largest pilgrimage out of any of the 10 more Relocation Authority sites. And so they get anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 people every year. It's at the end of April, and it really is a powerful experience. I've been a few times, but the thing that sticks out in my mind is the pilgrimage that was marked the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, and it was also the first pilgrimage after Trump was elected. And so that's when there was like 2,000, 2,500 people. Many people show up, many people from different backgrounds. It's not just Japanese Americans, many people from different religious faiths. So I know that many American Muslims go to that pilgrimage too, from the California area as well, because of the parallels in history between then and now, and what's going on in terms of the racial profiling and persecution. And so, but it is a very powerful experience, and also the site has a lot of interpretation and a lot of reconstruction. So there's a lot to see there. Yeah, it's really good.
The only thing I would warn is the high desert. It gets up over 100 in April.
Yeah. I photographed there. I had to do it this way, but I was in there in the summer photographing the remains and things like that. So it was over 100 degrees and just walking around for 8 hours or 9 hours a day out there. And so yeah, it can be pretty intense during the summer.
I have a lot of letters of my grandmother's in Japanese, and I was able to get at least a couple of them translated, and it's a totally different picture of the way she came across whenever she'd come visit us. Because she'd say, you know, to my mother, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with your daughter? Why is she always going out with these white boys instead of, you know, the Asians and all? But there's a gentleness that I'd really like to have somebody else translate the rest of the letters. I need a resource for that. And the other thing is that my grandfather, his English was really good. And he wrote letters from Poston to my dad when he relocated in Cleveland. And one of the things when he came to Minnesota, because my aunt and her husband was in the language school and everything, was that he said that when he came, there were two districts. There was Minneapolis and St. Paul. And you had to have permission to go from one district into St. Paul, even though they're right next to each other. And they wanted to live in St. Paul, but he had a job in Minneapolis, and so everything was held up. And then he got visited, so he just didn't do anything. He waited to see if that could get settled. And then his parole officer, because he'd been in Santa Fe, and said, you have to go to work, but we will get things straightened out. And it was through that kind of discussion and that was brought up by my grandfather. He says, we have got to do something about this because I'm not going to be the only East Bay families that want to go into St. Paul when they live on the other side. So eventually they got that changed so that they don't have to have permits to go from the two cities.
Cross a bridge or whatever.
Right, exactly. But if there's a resource, anyone knows a resource that can translate these letters, I really appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing. Any other questions?
Last week I heard a talk about the post-war, it's licensed agencies for maybe in Asia, and so usually this was known as white Christian organizations donated lots of food, especially powdered milk, to the devastated and struggling, studying Japanese people and lead it after the war. However, this talk by a historian said that actually Japanese Americans were very much involved in sending these relief products. But I guess the Japanese Americans did not have some kind of licenses to send food. So they asked the Christian organizations to be involved. And in history, I think they were credited. And Japanese Americans' contributions were somehow kind of hindered. But do you have any information in your history interviewing your family members that you mentioned today, like your Aunt Rosie was today, and strong connection with Japan was there. What was the sense of Japanese American community about the war-torn Japan? Talking about anything like that?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't have any family experiences that kind of tie into that. I will say though that like when I showed that one picture of like the crumbling ties between Japan because of that flag, you know, to me, what spoke that to me is when my grandfather came from Japan, he never went back. You know, he had family there, but he never went back. He had no interest in going back. He never visited any of that. My grandmother, the only time that she went back is when she took my Auntie Rosie and to drop her off, basically, to leave her there and say, okay, well, you'll get your education here. And then she never went back either. She didn't even go back when her own mother passed away, because I had a letter and photographs and things like that that she had received about the funeral. And so it was that thing of also, for some, it was just like a complete, once they came here, it's not like, today we can go back, travel across and things like that much easier and stay connected. That it was, for many Japanese Americans, once that Issei generation, once they came here, that was it. It's like going to another planet or something and just sort of a one-way trip. And but that's not everyone's experiences, but that was kind of my family's experience with those connections to Japan. And it's interesting because I was reading an oral history interview that my grandmother gave that I found years later. I didn't know she'd done this. And she had said something about how if you want to know what old Japan is like, look at what Japanese Americans are doing here, because when they're coming here at the earliest part of like the 20th century, that's their last sort of experience of Japanese culture and tradition, right? So they're still doing those things that came then, but whatever's changed since then is not reflected because it's sort of almost like a time capsule of Japanese culture, basically, when you look at like Japanese American sort of ritual and cultural kinds of experiences.
I'm reading a book on the MIS and the young men that went to Asia or to Japan or the Asian theater, and knowing that they, or fearing that they might meet up with their relatives on the other side. And there was one man who actually went to his commanding officer and he says, I am here to fight, but I would like not to go to this one particular area where he knew his brother or somebody was there. And they accommodated him, and so he didn't end up meeting his brother face to face. But I think there are lots of stories about that and the fear that they would, be faced with people that they knew. And I guess Kibe were very influential in the MIS because they could speak Japanese much better than the Nisei men that were learning Japanese so that they could do the work of the MIS. And so I'm sure that regardless, they were very faithful to the U.S., they were U.S. citizens, but I would imagine there were lots and lots of stories where people had really traumatic feelings because they had family that were in Japan, and maybe soldiers who were, the potential for them to meet up might occur.
Just very briefly, remember the Buddhist community did not have a strong network in the U.S. So when they went to the camps, there was nobody to support them. They had to support themselves. The Christian communities had a network. They had institutions and organizations already established long-standing that could do that. So that was definitely a strong point from the differences in tradition.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much for... Sure.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming today and being a part of this powerful experience. My name is Vinny Taguchi. I'm one of the younger members on the board of the local JCL chapter. And I wanted to let you know that we and some of the other young members are going to get together for an informal happy hour after this at the nearby Hmong Checkers bar to try to get to know each other and talk about some of the opportunities that are out there. If you know of some young people who might be interested in taking part but aren't here today, please come talk to me and I can tell you how to be a part of that. One of the opportunities, since we were talking about the Manzanar pilgrimage, the Chicago chapter of JCL organizes an event every summer where young people can travel from Chicago to Little Tokyo, learn about the community there, and then make a pilgrimage to the Manzanar site. And I was able to go to that last year, and it was a very powerful experience. So that's just one of the examples of the opportunities we have. So please come talk to me. Thank you.
What does young mean?
So there is a range. But it actually depends on the activity. There are several things, like there's a leadership advocacy workshop in DC that's open to all ages. For this trip to Manzanar, they limit it to 18 to 25, but they actually have a version for people above 26, and there's no upper limit on that. That one's not offered as often, so I don't think that's this summer, but it does come up every once in a while. Yeah.
Financial
Right. All right, thank you.